Criterion Collection has released the films in this set, World of Wong Kar Wai, on Blu-ray, and they are presented in these new restoration presentations. And Fallen Angels is described as, let's see, from the pages of the particular booklet that's included in this set, Fallen Angels is described as being in a new 2.39:1 framing that represents director Wong Kar Wai's original aesthetic vision for the film. And it also talks about this 4K restoration. And so we have a presentation which is a restoration presentation and is also essentially representing the film with a different aspect ratio. And that has a certain effect, and it changes the dynamic of the viewing experience of the film in a number of ways. And in fact, that's not the only point that needs to be mentioned in this context of presentation, but there's also the way in which certain framing points come about, and also the way in which black and white and color is used in certain key aspects of the film. But I will get to that in the later part of this discussion. Before I do, let me first talk about this particular disc and the supplements that can be found on this particular disc for Fallen Angels. So we have, as I say, the work Fallen Angels included on this particular disc in this set. And together with the film itself on this disc, we have a number of supplements. Some of them can be found on previous non-Criterion releases of the film, but there is one that I understand is brand new and made by Criterion in 2020. And it is called, and this is the first supplement, it is called Artist to Artist, 10 Questions for Wong Kar Wai. So what this is a type of Q&A that is conducted in this remote fashion. In other words, we have 10 artists, filmmakers, authors, and the like, and each of them is posing a question in some place in the world. And Wong Kar Wai then is seen sitting, and we understand that he is at the time he is making what we understand is his new series, and so there is some off time from his production of that new series, and he is taking this off time in order to answer and address these questions from these various filmmakers and authors and artists. So, and it's edited together in this way that is a Q&A fashion. So it's not a type of spontaneous type of asking of questions, but it's a question that perhaps was given, and then maybe Wong Kar Wai had some time to prepare, and then he delivered his response on camera in this edited fashion. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, I think his answers and responses are really there's a sense of the enigmatic as well as the clever and the mysterious and the direct, and I love that about his responses that he gives. But so this is approximately 14 minutes overall. And it says 10 questions for Wong Kar Wai. So what this implicates, or what this suggests, is there are 10 different people that are asking Wong Kar Wai certain questions. And for example, we have Sofia Coppola, who is asking Wong Kar Wai about growing up and his childhood. And this gives Wong Kar Wai the opportunity to tell us about how he was born in Shanghai, but then when he moved to Hong Kong when he was very young, about 5 years old, he says, and how there were occasions where in this time his mother took him to the cinema, and how from his point of view it wasn't necessarily a fact that it was world cinema, but it was just cinema from all sorts of places and all different languages, and that was the way it was, and that was what he was used to, which is a lovely anecdote about his introduction to the world of cinema and cinema going and his family, and how that was very important to him. And then we have Lisa Joy talking about, or asking about, where Wong Kar Wai gets his creative spark. What is that thing, or what is that point or aspect that provides the reasoning or impetus for his expressions of creativity. And Wong Kar Wai says that it really depends in essence, and he's talking about certain instances. It could be maybe a line of dialogue, or maybe something from childhood memory, which is a lovely link back to the earlier question from Sofia Coppola. And he talks about how, for example, maybe something that was in his childhood memory about, say, a martial arts school might influence him in terms of a martial arts film that he might make in his own career. Or maybe there is something to do with a tailor, and maybe how that tailor or that aspect or that childhood memory creates this creative spark in wanting to make a film that is akin to, or that where clothing and fashion is very important, for example, in The Mood for Love. And so for these and other reasons, he's giving instances of creative sparks. And a lot of times it comes from his wealth of childhood memories, which is a really fascinating aspect. And then another question is from author Andre Aciman, and this is a really interestingly phrased question. He talks about the type of dichotomy between the different voices, two fundamental voices that he seems to see and identify in the world and works of Wong Kar Wai. That is one that is very restrained and has a sort of muted quality to it, elegiac, so an elegy quality to it, and the other voice being a more brutal, violent outburst, emotional outburst type of quality into it. And I think we see in that interpretation, we see, I think, a film, Fallen Angels, falling quite nicely within that rubric. And so the question is, where do you feel more at home? And I think Wong Kar Wai answers it really well. He says he tries to find a balance, and the idea of light and dark, the opposite sides of the coin. And in fact, within the film Fallen Angels, we have potentially or arguably that sense of the duality between certain poles. You know, the darkness perhaps is represented by the hitman story, and then the lighter aspects might be represented by the Takashi Kaneshiro story. And to extend it further beyond the film, we can see two Fallen Angels being a type of one side of the coin, and then Chungking Express being the other side of the coin, which Wong Kar Wai expresses here and also in another supplement as well. So to see also the relationship dynamics between these two films and how that could also be an expression of this light-dark elegy brutality dichotomy that's expressed in this question. It's another great discussion point. And then we have fashion designer and filmmaker Laura Molivi, and we will have Kate Molivi in a separate question. But here, Laura's question is, what does an expiration date mean? And she is citing the very famous component of the expiration date and the cans of pineapple in the film Chungking Express. And here this gives Wong Kar Wai the opportunity to speak about time and temporal space and dimension, and how time and references to time are very important. And also, which is a really mind-blowing comment, and it's one that I didn't really think about until he made this comment, so it was very extraordinary from my point of view, which was that in the context of a discussion of time, he says how, especially with a film like Chungking Express, which was again released in '94, that is only a few years away from 1997, and this very significant year in terms of the relationship between Hong Kong and mainland China. And so this idea of time is very important, because there's the notion of time not being limitless, but in fact being limited, and the anxiety that might occur when one is reminded of the fact that indeed time is limited. So there's a sense of freedom in terms of the exploration of temporal space on the one hand, and also there is the inherent anxiety, angst, and fear when one considers the limitations of time, which is extraordinary. So a great question and a great answer here. And then we have a question from Chloe Zhao, who is asking about this wonderful connection between loneliness and solitude. And she also makes the case how they aren't always the same, and how this distinction is made in the context of Wong Kar Wai cinema. And Wong Kar Wai says in a really lovely way, he says, he talks about the fact that his characters in his films are characters in solitude searching for something to keep them from being lonely. And I thought that was such a lovely turn of phrase. And he gives certain examples. For example, the way in which the Tony Leung character in Chungking Express is talking to inanimate objects in his own room, like the bar of soap, for example. And so how this is an example of a character in solitude, but trying to keep from being lonely. And I think that type of dynamic can also be found in the characters in Fallen Angels. For example, the Michelle Reese character, or the Takashi Kaneshiro character, excuse me. So what a great question and another great answer. And continuing on, we have a question from Ryan Johnson, who says that he worked with actor Rachel Weisz, and how she had also appeared in the film by Wong Kar Wai, which is My Blueberry Nights. And so this gives him the opportunity to ask the director the question about what kind of efforts he makes in order to establish a type of mood or ambiance or atmosphere on the shooting set. And the example is given about how Wong Kar Wai would oftentimes be playing music on set in order to establish a mood of the piece. And so I thought that was really great, because this, the answer from Wong Kar Wai was about how he wants to try to find a sense of rhythm of a scene, and in order to do that, he will sometimes play music. He also has this great metaphor where he compares the director or filmmaker with a conductor of an orchestra. You know, oftentimes there are the comparisons made, the director of a film is like, say, an artist or a painter. But here, I like this comparison to a conductor of an orchestra, because it makes also that association, that inherent association, which is so fundamentally important in Wong Kar Wai's cinema. That is the role of music, and the idea of setting a rhythm. And I love this phrase too that he gives. He says it helps to establish the dance between the camera and the cast. This is fantastic, fantastic. So, but then continuing on, we have Kate Malevy's question, and we had Laura before. Now we have Kate Malevy, and she says, or she asks, how do you use fashion, or how is fashion and costume design significant in the works of Wong Kar Wai? And I think the specific example, for example, In the Mood for Love is cited, and William Chang Suk Ping and his key work in the world of Wong Kar Wai cinema, and in particular that film, how according to Wong Kar Wai, what he wanted to achieve was the idea of the dress or the decor, the fashion, setting or establishing a component or expressing of the character of that particular person. And how this is such a fundamentally important thing in that film too, because if we're thinking about Fallen Angels and how characters are trying to communicate in the context of absence, the absent other, communicating with the absent other. Here in The Mood for Love, we have in essence the idea of communication through non-communication. And some of those means are visual, and some of those are by the sheer slightest touch of one's hand, or also through the dress and decor, and so including the fashion sense. This is very important, fundamentally key. Great question and great answer. And then we have a question from Philippe Lesourd, cinematographer, about the organic way, sort of the artistic way, the Renaissance art type of way that Wong Kar Wai seems to be making his films. And he asks a really peculiar and brilliant question, which is, when do you know that you are finished with a film? And Wong Kar Wai says that he responds that storytelling is a series of questions, and you stop when you run out of such questions, and it's like a puzzle. And he refers to his work with cinematographer on the film Grandmaster, and how it took a long time, a long number of years, because there are always these questions that came up, and not knowing when you'd be done because you were still working on it, and there was this instinct of still working on it. You can always keep going. That's the refrain. And I think in a very subtle way, this is an interesting way to respond or to address certain, say, criticisms that some might have with regard to the restoration presentations of this set. Now, it's true also for Fallen Angels, but in general, we have a set or series of or collection of films where the presentations are in certain degrees altered or different from past presentations of the films. And so that might be an indication of Wong Kar Wai still wanting to, quote-unquote, work on the films even after the fact of their initial release, including this point of the Criterion box set. But in his words, at least in the context of this question, he says, you still want to keep going because storytelling is a series of questions. So very thought-provoking response. And then we have the question from author Jonathan Lethem, and he asks, is there a novel you always wanted to adapt but has eluded you? And Wong Kar Wai gives the answer, response of the work Dream of the Red Chamber. And so how he was given this, or he first knew about it because his father gave him the book when he was 10. And so, my goodness, if there ever was an opportunity for this type of film to be made by Wong Kar Wai, wow. But in any event, that's another great question and another great response. And then last but not least, to round out the questions, the 10 questions, we have one from cinematographer Bradford Young, who first takes the time to give Wong Kar Wai a wonderful, beautiful dedication and a type of explanation as to how and why the works of Wong Kar Wai meant, how much they meant to him. It's a lovely message. And then he then adds a question, which is, what is your relationship with the concept of mortality? And Wong Kar Wai then takes the opportunity to explain that from his point of view, filmmaking is like bullfighting. And you have choices leading to more choices. And so it's almost like a type of maybe adversarial type of relationship, but it also yields the possibility of the beautiful and the art. So this rounds out the questions from various artists to the filmmaker artist Wong Kar Wai. So all in all, I think it's a really illuminating and insightful look, a Q&A fashion. It's a new supplement, and it is only 14 minutes, but it is, I think, well worth checking out because you're getting these answers that are perhaps direct. Sometimes they are cryptic and enigmatic, but that's part of the charm and great attraction, I think, to the world of Wong Kar Wai and the way he expresses himself in these ways that are very mysterious, but also they lead to more things. Again, storytelling is like a series of choices or questions leading to questions, choices leading to choices. And in fact, this is this idea of a cycle. And it's expressed even in this Q&A from Wong Kar Wai, so it is splendid. Then we have in the supplement section a 7-minute, approximately 7-minute supplement that is described as being from 2002. And this is a one-on-one interview with Christopher Doyle, and it's a very casually given interview, and he is talking about various aspects of the shooting of Fallen Angels, and he talks about one of the first shots that was made in the film. It actually comes a little bit later in the film, but it's a close-up of Michelle Race and how this is an example of the use of the lens and the wide-angle lens and the close-up that was almost to the point of distorting the image itself, and how this leads to Christopher Doyle's discussion about how there needs to be this sense of trust, the trust relationship between the actors who are playing the roles in front of the camera and the people who are operating the camera and behind the camera. Sometimes those results might lead to, say, less than flattering depictions of the particular artists that are on display, but there is always a purpose and meaning and significance behind all the choices that are made. And indeed, this is one of the great points that the cinematographer Christopher Doyle makes here and elsewhere, because he is saying that this film, or the making of this film Fallen Angels, and using that point as an example, he's saying how much freedom that he was able to enjoy in this working relationship with Wong Kar Wai, of course, but this idea of freedom of choice. After all, the composition of an image is down to the camera movement and where the camera is placed and the number of lights used and the film stock and the filtering, etc. And all these choices of a chemical and technical nature are combined in order to achieve some kind of effect akin to an emotional response, or the mimicking of an emotional state of being in the human condition. So I love how in his comments implicitly is this core connection between the chemistry and technology of cinematography on the one hand and the human emotional states on the other. And this is such a fundamental connection, and there's an inherent sort of excitement in the way he's expressing it as well. And he's also very clever and witty, and he has all these jokes, and working with Wong Kar Wai, and he's so tall, he says, and there's this witty banter that is also part of the proceedings. So this is the interview with Christopher Doyle, approximately 7 minutes. This interview, by the way, was included in a previous non-Criterion release. This is the UK Region B Blu-ray that I have, the Artificial Eye Blu-ray that I have, and so you can find that particular supplement, the Christopher Doyle interview, as one of the supplements on, say, this past non-Criterion release. Also, part of this earlier non-Criterion release is another supplement. In that past release, they're actually combined together into one supplement, which is described as being this discussion, this Christopher Doyle discussion. But in fact, that this earlier non-Criterion release actually has that one supplement, and here in Criterion, they've taken that one supplement and divided it into two. The first being the Christopher Doyle interview, and then the second being this collection of deleted scenes. It's actually divided into 3 sections, and those deleted scenes sections are called Only You, Whom You Miss, and A Beautiful Evening. And in fact, they are, perhaps it's more accurate to call them a little bit of deleted scenes, but also an explanation from Wong Kar Wai about some aspects of the film and what it was he was trying to achieve with some aspects of the film. Not necessarily specifically comments on the deleted scenes per se, but just more on the film itself. And so, as I say, we have these 3 sections. The first is called Only You, and this is approximately 8 minutes. And here we have interview comments from Wong Kar Wai, and he's talking about the connections between Fallen Angels and Chungking Express, and how maybe it had found its genesis as possibly being the 3rd story in the Chungking Express cycle of stories, but it ended up becoming its own thing. So it also operates as a spiritual sequel type of feeling with Chungking Express. It is also having this idea of the opposite side of the coin. Chungking Express might be sort of a lighter side, although there are dark elements about it. It is contrasted with some of the more heavier elements of Fallen Angels, although, granted, there are some lighter moments in Fallen Angels as well. Speaking of such lighter moments, in this discussion, Wong Kar Wai also takes the time to mention Takeshi Kaneshiro and the beauty of his comic timing. And it's really great, too, because Takeshi Kaneshiro has this wonderful comedic sense, a physical comedy sense. He's like almost a silent film comedian come to life on the screen in Fallen Angels. So I'm so glad that Wong Kar Wai mentions that in that context. And so then we have the scenes, or the deleted scene sections in question, and these are the sections in the film where the Takeshi Kaneshiro character meets or has encounters with the Michelle Race character. And this happens perhaps in the latter parts of the film, and so we see certain ways in which this part is expanded to see these 2 characters together, and we see them essentially following through with the basic conceit of the Takeshi Kaneshiro character breaking into certain storefronts at night and playing around inside and role-playing and such. And we have Michelle Race there in that wonderful demeanor that she carries with her character. And indeed, also, there is the way in which there is a beautiful, sudden burst of romantic emotional intensity, a kiss of sort that is very much like a famous kissing scene that we saw in an earlier Wong Kar Wai work, which is called in English As Tears Go By. And so we have this really fascinating dynamic between these 2 characters in this deleted scenes fashion. In the final film, of course, we are left with a certain set of, say, circumstances that don't necessarily lead in one direction or another, but in fact they have a type of a connection of sorts. But here we have the deleted scenes that maybe in certain ways might be said to be leading the characters down certain paths or avenues. It's very fascinating in that way and in others. So and that's the first section, and that is approximately 8 minutes. Then the second portion of this deleted scenes part is called Whom You Miss. This is approximately 4 minutes, and this is dealing with the person and also the actor, Chen Manlei, and he is the real-life manager of the Chungking Mansions hotel, and he actually, we understand, makes a brief appearance in Chungking Express, but here he has a very major role in Fallen Angels as being the father of the Takashi Kaneshiro character. And it's great to see this person, this real-life person and actor, and he's in this office, and he's talking about meeting Wong Kar Wai for the first time in his dark sunglasses, and he was also mentioned how he was nominated for the Best Newcomer Award at the Hong Kong Film Awards, and so it's really that's just a testament to the power and impact of his particular performance. It's one of the great sources of the heart and soul of the film, is that relationship dynamic between father and son. And also there is this great detail about how Takashi Kaneshiro and Chen Manlei spoke the same dialect, Minnan dialect, and so that engendered a sense of closeness between the two actors. And also there's this great comment towards the end where he says, and he watched the film twice and he still didn't understand the film. So such a lovely conversation. And then plus we have certain scenes, deleted scenes again, to expand on the storyline between his character and Takashi Kaneshiro's character. So we see further developments of that. It ended up not being in the final film, but it's again great expansion of that relationship dynamic. And then the third of the deleted scenes is called A Beautiful Evening, approximately 3 minutes. And here we have that shot of that was referred to by Christopher Doyle in his interview, which is the really iconic close-up of Michelle Reyes in the eatery as the chaos of the fight is happening behind her, and then how this leads into some footage that wasn't included of other close-ups of people eating or doing things, and other characters engaged in certain activity and drinking or at a karaoke bar or talking on the phone or things of that nature. So and then the way in which they are linked in terms of time and space and song and only you, right? And so this is something that again is another great example of a deleted scenes montage. And then there's the great closing comments made by Wong Kar Wai about how this really was a type of, the filmmakers had this adventurous spirit about the making of this film, and it really showed him and others that you can really make a film anywhere at any time, and as long as you have the energy and courage to do so. And so I think that is a great way to end this particular section of supplements. Once again, I should say that yes, this does appear in past non-Criterion releases, as I indicated, but it is also really great to have, not just in terms of deleted scenes, but also these comments that are provided by Wong Kar Wai in the interviews, excerpts that are edited into this particular section. So please check it out if you can. And then to round out the supplements on this disc, we have the trailer. So it's a very interesting trailer, so please check that out too if you have the opportunity. Now, that is a discussion of what can be found on the disc where Fallen Angels is contained. And so speaking of Fallen Angels, now let me speak about the presentation. And this has been, as far as I understand, based on, say, initial reactions and reviews of this particular set. In particular, Fallen Angels has gotten a lot of attention because of a number of reasons. Primarily, we have the reasons that I cited earlier, which is the reestablished or new aspect ratio, and I understand it was from 1.85 to 1 to this new presentation, which is 2.39 to 1. And then the other aspect is how that affects the framing of certain shots, and also the use of black and white and color. And indeed, there are some very major differences in terms of the use in black and white in color. And so these two fundamental categories of changes associated with this restoration presentation as found in the Criterion set are changes that I'll be perfectly honest, I have been trying in my own subjective way to try to understand and to digest from the viewpoint of a viewer, and especially from the viewpoint of someone who I really love this film, Fallen Angels. It depends on the mood and the day of the week when one asks it, but if someone were to ask me what is my favorite Wong Kar Wai film, again, I could say Fallen Angels. It is, I love this film, and I've loved this film ever since I first saw it. And of course, when I first saw it back in the day, it was this earlier non-restoration presentation of the film. And so that's what I've been used to, leading up all the way from, say, my early exposure to the film, and then later getting the film on other forms of physical media, DVD, and later Blu-ray, and then leading up to the Criterion Collection presentation, which is strikingly different. And so for these two reasons. And so it was my initial impression that these differences in the aspect ratio and in some key aspects of the black and white and color usage were differences that affected my viewing of the film in a negative manner. This was my initial impression because they felt strikingly different. For example, the aspect ratio application, the results of which are such that you have instances where some points of background or some visual information is cut or cropped out of the frame. And so, for instance, you have a shot where, say, the McDonald's logo or the M logo, for most of it, which would have been, for the most part, mostly visible in the background in, say, the earlier presentation of this film, is now, by virtue of this Criterion presentation, cropped even further, so you get even less of the M, as it were. And that's true also of background information. There's a lot of language in various, say, words and writings and posters that can be found in the backgrounds. And so if you do a side-by-side comparison, which is what I did, you can see directly where a lot of the language is cropped off from the tops and also sometimes from the sides. And so some of the signage, some of the clocks in the background are cut off where they would have otherwise been shown in full or almost in full in, say, the earlier non-Criterion presentations. Also, incidental to that, there are some instances where you do have slight color tints that are different to, say, the same scenes as they existed in the past non-Criterion presentations. Not thoroughly and not completely, but every once in a while in the Criterion presentation, you'll get, say, a sign that otherwise would have been, say, a bright white glow in an earlier presentation, but now in Criterion, in the box set, it has a slight greenish hue to it. But then there are occasions where you have indoor scenes in, say, earlier presentations that were darker that are now brightened up in the Criterion presentation. So it has this, say, selective means by which the color scheme and the filtering seems to be on and off depending on the particular situations. Generally speaking, for the outdoors dark nighttime scenes with a lot of the neon lights, etc., oftentimes, or generally speaking, one can say, or I could say, that there is a slight greenish tint. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes. That doesn't affect me in my viewing of this film overall. What affected me more was, for example, this cropping effect due to the new aspect ratio. And it had the effect of also emphasizing the stretched out horizontal nature of the film in this new Criterion presentation, which wasn't necessarily the case for me when I was watching it in the older release versions. Now, as I was re-exploring this particular version, this Criterion version, I began to feel like it had this very interesting psychological effect upon me as the viewer, which is that granted there was information that was, say, lost or cropped off, and so but ultimately, it didn't necessarily affect, say, the plot, for example. There weren't any bits of information that were essential to the plot, per se, that were cut off. You could still understand that this is McDonald's, or you can still understand that time is being expressed through the clocks in the background, or the language and the landscape, how language is part of the landscape of Hong Kong due to various languages, Korean, Chinese, and Japanese, and English, that are expressed here, there, and everywhere. And so, although you have some of the visual information that is cropped, you still get the essence of that. So, in that way, it didn't affect me in my overall experience as I began to get used to it. And furthermore, this idea of the emphasis on the horizontal stretching, this notion about how Wong Kar Wai and Christopher Doyle in other interviews were suggesting that perhaps this was their initial plan in order to emphasize the nature of the wide angle lenses being used, again exemplified by that iconic shot that they had of the close-up of Michelle Reyes' character. And so this might be an indication of that type of look that they were going for in the first place. And if you are with that, then you can see that there is, yes, indeed, this emphasis on the warped, stretched out, almost horizontal effect that this aspect ratio seems to have, at least comparatively speaking. Also, in a very interesting psychological effect, from my point of view anyway, the idea of this information being cropped off, like clocks, for example, that are obviously cropped off halfway or more, or the M logo of McDonald's cropped off below the midpoint, etc., or words that would have been visible are now cropped. That also has this interesting effect of, it's obvious that they are cropped and they're cut off at a certain point, which perhaps suggests a type of further sense of alienation and isolation and pressure and claustrophobia, because things are somewhat cramped, and there is a visual indication of that type of cramped pressure in a sort of maybe a subliminal type of way. And in that way, I think that is very much consistent with the type of character perspective that can be said to be part of the emotional landscape, which is the emphasis on alienation, isolation, solitude, and or loneliness. And if we have the sense of claustrophobia and stretched out nature, the warped sense of the world, as well as the sense of more space leading to a further emphasis on the isolation, and I think that has a very potentially positive impact on future viewings of the film. Now, once again, for those who are prefer the earlier Criterion versions, then I suggest that you try to get your hands on some of those non-Criterion versions, because they are really great, and they're really fun means by which one can do a comparison and contrast. But this is my way of saying also that I think there is a case to be made about how these changes, although they are quite drastic, and they do, I admit, take some getting used to, at least as far as I'm concerned, once one gets used to them or starts to get used to them, then one, I think, might be able to see, or I was able to see anyway, the means by which they can have a really positive effect on the viewing of the film that still feels consistent with the general thrust or approach or character dynamics or thematic concerns that I think are there in the film. So that is a very interesting aspect in terms of the aspect ratio. Once again, I know it won't please everyone, and I know it doesn't, and it isn't pleasing everyone at the moment, but there is that possibility, and I do recognize that possibility, at least as far as my own engagement, personal engagement with the film in that level. Then the second fundamental issue that I found was the use of color in black and white. Now, in earlier non-Criterion presentations, there were a number of black and white scenes that existed, and they were very striking because they were few, but when they occurred, they really stuck out in this beautiful, dynamic way, and a lovely composition of image. There's the opening shot, for example, that is the hitman and the woman, famous close-up and background shot, the cigarette and smoke, and the laconic nature of it. Now, in some instances, with these black and white shots that existed in earlier past presentations, we have the introduction of certain selected areas that have been colorized. Not the entire picture, but some aspects that have been colorized. For example, in this opening shot, the ring that Michelle Reyes' character is seen to be wearing, as well as her lipstick, is colorized, whereas the rest of the scene is black and white. And so this is a change that is startling because it's right there immediately. And it's something that, as I say, people who know the film will be expecting this black and white scene, but will be getting something that is not totally black and white. A similar thing happens later in the film with a very famous and important sequence involving sitting at the bar and listening to an important song that is coming from the jukebox in the background. Now, before that shot was in black and white, but now in the Criterion presentation, the jukebox background portion is now in black and white, as well as some other peripheral parts of that particular part of the shot. So here again it is another black and white shot, but now for the new presentation, one part of it is colorized. Again, this is it changes the dynamic of these particular shots. And so when I first saw it, I must admit to being somewhat startled to the point of being very distracted by this change. But upon rewatch and rewatch and rewatch, I've come to see these particular moments as, again, emphasizing a certain inherent juxtaposition and inherent contradiction within these various moments of the film. So, for example, the contradiction as expressed in the contradiction between black and white and color inherently in the first opening shot might be said to be a sort of metaphor for the inherent contradiction of these two characters. They are seen to be together in the same shot, but yet there is much distance between them. And that distance will be further explored as that plot line progresses. So they are together, but they are not together, just as much as there's a contradiction between black and white and color. And there's also, as well as a contradiction, a lovely type of way in which black and white and color in this particular scene complement each other. And so there is also that dynamic that is possible between the characters, the Lian Lai character and Michelle Rhys character. There's a contradiction, but there's also a complementary nature to them. The same or similar thing can be said for the jukebox scene in the bar. There's a way in which there's a separation between the reality of the space and also the message of the song. And so that separation perhaps can be best visually expressed in colorizing the jukebox, which can be said to be representing the song element itself, whereas the rest of the world is totally alien and foreign. This, I think, adds that visual element, the possibility of interpreting it as a visual representation of the schism that is existing at that particular moment in the film. So in those ways, I think the adaptation or the adding of color elements within a black and white shot, I think, can serve a certain reading of the film that could be consistent with the overall effect of the film, even in past incarnations or past presentations of fallen angels. And then there should be other examples cited too, because there are other instances where, say, black and white shots or there's one instance where a black and white shot in the earlier presentation is now a color shot in the Criterion presentation, and it occurs around the time where the Lian Lai hitman character gets injured. There's a quick shot of the outside of the window and the passing traffic at night. It used to be black and white, but now it's color, if memory serves. Also, there is a moment, a very famous moment, and I'm referring once again to this iconic close-up shot of Michelle Rhys's character towards the end of the film. This moment has always been and this is a shot involving her close-up, and at the same time in the background, a fight or brawl breaks out all of a sudden and quite chaotically, and somewhat comedically too, if I do say so myself. But this moment has always been in color in past instances. Here in the Criterion presentation, we have an instance where a color scene has now been turned into black and white, and it's an extended one too. It's not a brief, quick couple second shot. It's quite extended. It goes on for a couple minutes, I think, and so it is significant, and it's conspicuous in the fact that it is black and white. And we are reminded of this too, because if you check out, for example, the Christopher Doyle interview, which is one of the supplements, you have that same shot, but it's shown in color. So it's actually the pre-Criterion release version that's part of that interview edited into the Christopher Doyle interview. So you can actually compare what the Criterion presentation is versus what the earlier presentation was by looking at the interview itself. But the point here is that we have a major scene that is now changed quite fundamentally. And so when I first saw this scene too, and this change, I was shocked by it, to be perfectly honest. I thought it was a very poor choice. And it really affected my viewing of this moment quite negatively, because this is one of the things that I looked forward to, because this is, as I say, such an important moment. And it's startling because it is so different. However, I have since then come around, and I believe that it does serve a very important function, and a very positive one, because what it does, and I didn't realize this until quite recently, but what it does, or what it did, the effect it had on me, was that it had there's this extended point in time, or this extended period of time where this was the black and white sequence, and you had the meeting between certain characters. And then it leads to this rush of movement, the passing highway, and riding the motorcycle at night, and only you. And it's a very famous sequence. Well, the fact that we go from a black and white scene, an extended black and white scene, it suddenly cuts to this rush of speed and adrenaline and color and emotion, that makes that cut even more of an impact. If you go from black and white to color, it becomes this really big, impactful moment. And I didn't realize that until I had seen the film, again, the Criterion presentation, a number of times. So I go back and forth on this one. Which one do I prefer? My heart perhaps says ultimately I will probably always prefer the color version of this particular sequence. However, I have come around to now respect and even admire, and greatly admire so, this choice of black and white, because, as I say, it creates the contrast between this current scene and what is to come. And what is to come is this beautiful rush of energy, excitement, and emotion with only you on the soundtrack. And so this, I think, creates that contrast, which is so key and needed. And it means that that final moment of the film has even yet the possibility for even more of an impact or significance. And in fact, that is probably a really good thing too, especially when you have people who are watching this film not for the first time. And so that scene therefore gains a new sense of, say, impact and memorability, because that startling contrast between the black and white and the color is really startling, and it leads to this wonderful finish. And so I really admire that. I didn't understand it before, but now I think it works for me. Is it my favorite version? Probably not, but still, I can really admire it for what I think it is trying to do in that regard. And indeed, the black and white, that's nothing to take away from the black and white portion, because the black and white portion is really quite vivid and stark and wonderfully managed. It is a bit of a violent scene, but the fact that it's set in black and white tends to, say, diminish the violent aspects or the bloody aspects, and makes it more in the realm of maybe a type of comic film, or even a black and white silent film too. And if we recall the comments of Wong Kar Wai and his comments about Takashi Kaneshiro, and how that could also be interpreted to be like compliments about Takashi Kaneshiro's physical comedy, which in my eyes is akin to, say, a silent film comedian. This idea of Takashi Kaneshiro in this particular situation, in this scene, in black and white, is very much part of this dynamic. And so we saw it in another aspect of the film earlier on in his story with the Charlie Young character, and the famous scene in the rain and the shots of them together. But here, with the newly applied black and white sequence, here we have, I think, that silent film dynamic maybe brought to the fore just a little bit more, and so maybe less receding into the background, the violent, bloody aspects, in favor of the silent film comedic aspects. And so in that way too, there's an interesting shift of dynamic that I think arguably still serves a consistent support for our reading of the film, that still holds in terms of the importance of that character and the blending or merging of these two story points at this key point of the film. And so I think overall I can see and I can appreciate and admire from my own subjective viewpoint the changes that have been made. And so I'm very much I really believe that. And so as I say, I understand if it's not the preferred version for certain people, and if that's the case, you can always rely on past releases, and so you can still hopefully get those if you are interested. It would have been great, of course, if Criterion had included both versions, or non-restored version versus the new restored version, for some comparison, so to give us, the viewers, the choice in terms of what version that we preferred. I would have loved that, but oh well, this is what we get. And so there are still those non-Criterion versions out that you can hopefully get your hands on if you are interested. But from my vantage point, this new Criterion version seems to me to still, even with its changes, those changes still, I think, there's an argument to be made, and a very strong argument, that those changes still serve a consistent support for many readings of this film. And I don't think they go against those readings at all. In fact, in certain perspectives, they, I think, enhance those readings further. And so that's my take on the restoration aspect of this particular film, Fallen Angels, as it's included in the Criterion set. So overall, my friends, this is, as I say, one of my favorites from Wong Kar Wai, and I'm just, it took me a while to really digest this information in the set, but and I took the opportunity to watch it a number of times. Every single time I was blown away. What a delight this film is. And so I encourage you, my friends, to watch it, rewatch it, and rewatch it again. What a wonderful exploration and expression of the cinema of Wong Kar Wai. This is Fallen Angels. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.